Hello and welcome from me, Sandra McLeod, and all at Echo Research to the latest episode in our Straight Talking podcast series addressing and sharing issues common to all our clients and wider community. In this session on human-centered leadership, Echo Advisory Board member, International Non-Executive Director and mentor, Rosie Halfhead, speaks to global executive coach and educator, Nancy Glynn. In high demand during COVID, with valuable insights to offer about challenges CEOs are facing, Nancy talks to Rosie about the urgent imperatives facing all leaders, with human vulnerability and emotions, focus on truth and genuine authenticity, and broad-based communications at the very heart of skillful navigation ahead. Drawing on neurological insights and latest research, this session offers tips for the C-suite and for communication professionals alike to redesign and refocus how we move forward. We hope you find this helpful for where you are now. So with that, over to you, Rosie. Take it away.
Thank you, Sandra, and welcome, Nancy. It's a delight to have you here today in this Straight Talking podcast series, picking up maybe a little bit on some of the topics that were aired in the last conversation around data ethics, AI, all these different challenges for leadership and for communicators. But I'm curious, because of your background, that we're going to take a slightly different angle today and explore the whole area of leadership and communication. And indeed, I saw a quote recently from a former dean of Harvard Business School who said communication is the real work of leadership. So it's not something that's kind of an add-on, as both of us know, because obviously we were both in communications roles. We met many years ago when we were both working in Brussels. And we were enlightened enough, I think, at that stage to kind of want to meet people from outside our own sectors and talk about the challenges they were facing, share best practice, and sort of get clues for how to do our jobs better. And, you and I have stayed in touch over all of these years. Our careers have gone off in completely different directions. But every time we meet and every time we have a chat, it's always very rich and enlightening. And so I'm really delighted that you've come along to join us today and that Echo have brought us together.
Thank you, Rosie. I'm also delighted to be here with you and also enjoy our rich exchanges and pleased that Echo invited us to do this. Yes, indeed, all of the things you mentioned in the introduction are incredibly preoccupying leaders. And we saw enormous shifts during the pandemic, the first 2 years of the pandemic, that are being sustained in many ways. So it's top of mind. Everything you mentioned is top of mind. It's always in the context. And then if you add to that the speed of digitalization and the integration of AI, the fact that we're dealing with so many things we've never dealt with before, it's not a joke. There really is no playbook for what we're facing now. So that's one of the reasons for advocating, and the research supports this human-centered leadership. If we return to who we are as human beings, to values-based, decent, principled, and with our faults, which are also normal and welcome, we can then actually navigate these things more skillfully.
So that sort of says that in the current context, particularly as we sort of think more about like the whole issue around climate change, social injustice, that really brings the human much more into the center of conversations and in terms of businesses. And I imagine that, we know that companies are increasingly concerned, or actually they're putting a lot of effort into sustainability and ESG, but they're equally concerned from a reputational point of view. There could be stakeholder activism. They're under public scrutiny all the time. There are even risks of litigation. So the lines are really blurring, I feel, between kind of the role of communicators and the business more generally, and the stakes are even higher. I was interested to read the other day that the UN Secretary General, when he was addressing thousands of new graduates, actually telling them not to take up careers with climate wreckers. I mean, he really didn't mince his words. He talked about no amount of greenwashing or spin can change the reality of what's happening with fossil fuels. Simply put, they're lying. So, when you consider that in the context of communications, this idea of social license, I think, is becoming so much more important. And really this idea of you've got to kind of think from a communications perspective, how you're going to engage with your stakeholders and how you're going to make sure that you're understanding how they feel, doing the right research, how they want to respond to the communication. And basically that truth is becoming really, really essential. And therefore leaders have to make sure that they're walking this fine line between, what the business, different investors want to hear, but what their employees want to hear, and what all their different stakeholders are hearing. And maybe this is where we're bringing the human-centered piece back into the world of leadership, Nancy.
Oh yes, Rosie, I would agree entirely. Let's say the need for human-centered leadership was growing out already in the beginning of the 21st century for many of us, and it's very present in the research as well. We're seeing it as an imperative. Now it is an urgent imperative, and for all of the reasons that you've described. And what do we mean by that? That means, again, returning to our own humanity. There's authenticity, and it has to be, of course, authenticity related to one, what am I saying versus what am I doing? And also authentically honest about what can or cannot be done. That's quite important. There's humility that's needed. There's permission to be human. And then that leads us into, with permission to be human, actually it is in our human nature to survive. And it is in our human nature to want to protect our future, which would be all of the ESG goals. And it is also, it's very important in our world today to increase the diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is not a nice to have. That is really something that's essential. And if I picked up on what you said about not the greenwashing and such, I think this is so important for leaders and for communicators. And you and I have been with companies that have gone through crises. In my case, it was a company that faced a really, really severe product liability crisis that actually led to a Chapter 11 filing. And as a relatively young communication manager responsible for communications in Europe, I was so fortunate to be in a company that approached this from a human perspective, recognized its shortcomings, also recognized where it didn't have shortcomings, but were brought as if they did into the media. And through the really honest and caring communication from the company, which was authentic, it was both within and without, the company not only survived, it actually thrived through that kind of a situation. And that's no different in the pandemic. We've seen how people respond. People give themselves permission now towards a company, towards an employer, to state their needs as human beings. And there were quite some advantages to what we lived through in the lockdowns. On the one hand, very difficult to be separated from people at work. And at the same time, recognizing that we actually were connecting with people in their homes. So there was also a different kind of connection that was possible in that time.
Yeah, I think I'm just actually something that struck me when you were speaking there and your experience when you lived through the crisis and the kind of the human approach to that at the time. This was many, many years ago, I know. And these were in the days before there was no real talk of purpose. And yet, obviously, now that's something that's become very much a forefront in leaders' minds and organizations, to have this sort of sense of the North Star, which is going to be guiding them through these challenging times, and that should be guiding them in their sort of communications efforts as well. But I guess there's also this idea of, if I think back to my many years doing change communication, it's still very much within the confines of the business. It's how do we actually change behaviors and mindsets within the business to do things differently? Whereas now, I think there's this sense of that every single person is a human being, but is also a citizen of the planet. And therefore, what we're trying to get them to do through maybe business communications and beyond is changing their lifestyles and making sure that their beliefs and their values are kind of relevant in business, but also in society. So that's where this blend, I think, comes in, which is just so much more critical today.
Indeed, and I think that businesses have such an important role to play, and they have far more influence and power for good than I think, let's say, as a whole, they realize. There's one person who's working also on change in the world, the types of changes you and I are describing, that actually said one of the benefits of working with businesses on this is that when you do achieve a shift in a business, you actually have, in most cases, a global impact of some kind. because businesses do operate globally. So you really can have a much wider impact than one realizes. So their role in having been, in many ways, as said by the UN Secretary General, climate wreckers, they can actually shift that role to something else. And they're, again, getting not just permission, but requirement by society to say, every one of us, I mean, I think if everyone looks seriously in the mirror, we all realize we can't keep going the way we have, and that changes are needed. And I think that the communicators, the leaders in communications, are at a very important place to help enable that. The role that they play is also to be a truth teller internally. I know many leading communicators who have worked for years with their organizations, and sometimes with great success, in changing the stakeholder relations from a type of let us convince and persuade you of our point of view to let's actually share points of view and perspectives with a degree of openness and actually see what we can co-create. And that maps very much to the kind of leadership that's needed today. Again, very well researched, very well evidenced. A leadership agility, if you're operating at the more advanced levels of leadership agility, you are operating that way. You're not in a conversation and learning about others for the purpose of purely persuading them, or in some cases even manipulating them. You are all operating in these cases into a form of catalyzing or co-creation.
That's fascinating, because if you think about, the art of persuasion and kind of what communication very often was, that's what it was trying to achieve, right? But you've mentioned authenticity a couple of times, and so I'm just curious in terms of when you're working with leaders, particularly if they are of a certain age, which could be the generation of command and control, but now having to move into this co-creating sort of situation. How are they adapting to that? How well are they kind of embracing that? I mean, you must be experiencing that through your client work, I guess.
It's surprisingly, there's a surprising openness to this, perhaps, Rosie. One of the key things that I've always found with leaders to help them, let's say, make a shift, particularly to areas that would not conform to the practices, or what I would even call myths, that we hold on to in business. One of the keys to that is permission. At the end of the day, if you show them the evidence and the science and the reason, how does motivation really work? What is intrinsic motivation and psychological well-being? What are the characteristics of that? Help them to recognize that the latest science shows, the science of emotions shows us that there is no such thing as rational thinking in absence of emotions. And so by holding on to those myths, they're actually handicapping themselves. The book that I would recommend on that, actually for all leaders, is the newly published book called Emotional by Len Miletinov, which is the new thinking about emotions. And that will open a whole new world for them. The good news is that once you recognize that our emotions are the backdrop and inform all of the way that we take in information, the way we process it, which information we even take in or extract from our memories, and what decisions we take. Once we recognize that, there are also ways to not control our emotions, which isn't what we need to do, rather to work with them, to become familiar with them, to have ways of regulating. And also this consciousness of recognizing that I'm about to make a decision, and actually I'm not in the right state of mind to make that decision. So they're incredibly open to this. I think there are two things: their permission and then the how. So at the end of the day, don't tell me I need to do something if I don't know how to get there. And that's why, as you know, my work has been really about that, working with them on developing different capacities like reflective capacity, positive regard, inquiry ability, attention management. These are all things that you can develop. And by developing these, you're then able to build the capacities needed for the type of leadership we've been describing.
Wow. So, I mean, it's interesting. So I used to use a model, many years ago, which was trying to sort of understand the level, particularly in change communication. So the levels of likelihood of success when you were going through something, and you needed to kind of have the rational understanding and buy-in, and you needed to have the emotional kind of buy-in as well. And we used to do sort of research to say, how many people are going to be the champions because they get the rational and the emotional. The weak links are the ones who don't really get either of those. But then the ones that were the worrying ones from a communications perspective were often the bystanders. So it's like, they've got the rationale behind it, but they actually are not bought into it. So how do you make them change? Or the opposite, which would be, I think they were called the loose cannons, which was they were super enthusiastic, but not necessarily fully understanding. So this sort of, as you've talked about now, this blend between making sure that you're kind of bringing in the emotional component, that must be a struggle, for some leaders. And also then, of course, when communications people are trying to work with leaders, they're trying to play to the style and the strength of those leaders, when in fact they're actually a bit contradictory, or am I misinterpreting that?
I think that what you've described is part of the reality. It must be part of the reality that the communicators meet. What I have found is that when generally the leaders are open when you offer those two things, the permission, which means giving them a science and evidence base of why it's important, and that it actually will lead to sustainable high performance. And as you mentioned, in today's world, it'll also lead to social license, a license to operate. On the one hand, the permission, on the other hand, how do I get there? And that's, again, where I think a communicator is very, very helpful. They are very helpful at creating environments that can help these leaders build skills. They are very useful as internal sounding boards, as people of confidence, someone that you can trust. And those are qualities that should not be underestimated right now. What I would offer, and that's something that you and I have talked about a few times, is I would offer that there's a tremendous opportunity for communications leaders to delve into some of this world that I'm describing. So that's become my field, having left the C-suite. I moved into executive development. And yet, when I think back, if I had had even 10 or 15% of the knowledge and skills that I have now, that would have made me a far greater and more effective communications leader. So I would offer to communicators, let's say, widening the horizons, partnering with people in their organizations and outside their organizations who are specialists in leadership development, organizational development, and the study of high performance. And that would be let's say an additional part of the value that they can bring to their organizations.
That really takes us beyond the realms of the communications function as maybe we knew it. And I'm sure more and more communicators are essential partners within the business now, which was something I was always a proponent of, rather than having these kind of functional areas. And for those who are working in matrix environments, for working in global environments, they need to be establishing those links in so many different dimensions. And I think this idea of, evidence-based research and science being part of the skill set and the capacities that as communicators we all have to kind of take on board or learn more about, because ultimately, we are trying to appeal to change people's kind of behaviors or emotions, or get them to be part of something. I'm just wondering, backtracking a bit to something that you said earlier, obviously related to the pandemic and the different ways of working now, and the whole area around hybrid and remote teams and things. It's funny, I was thinking that when I was running a global team, but I was actually based in Hong Kong, so I was having to work across time zones, and very often I was in Hong Kong and a lot of my team would have been sitting in an office in Brussels or in New York. And I always felt very frustrated that the dynamic of what was going on in the room seemed to be more dominant than trying to bring in the person, i.e. me, who was remote, but I was supposedly also the leader. And when I think about how things have changed now with Zoom or with Teams, the amount of distraction that can still be happening while you're on these calls, you've got the chats, you've got you can still be processing your email, you've got, you're supposed to be trying to focus on one thing, but there's lots of other distractions around you. I know that that's probably the norm for millennials and Gen Z and the generations that will follow those. But there is something in there that kind of says, how can this be more efficient from the way that we're processing, assimilating that information? Are we really hearing it? Are we really listening? all of those things that make for effective communications and the meeting in the middle.
Yes, it's a challenge, and I think a tremendous opportunity right now with what you're describing. I mean, the hybrid way of working, if anyone who reads what's out there or listens to what's out there, it pretty much is here to stay, in the fact that there were tremendous advantages from it. But that means as we're going back to a mix of in-office and online, what I'm encouraging my clients to do, and again, I think communicators have a huge role to play here, is really redesigning entirely how they carry out those interactions. Again, borrowing from what we know works in terms of human interaction. So, for example, one of the things that is a barrier for many people is that they feel that they can't connect with others online effectively. And while connecting online is different, you actually can connect quite strongly. I mean, my type of work is all about human connection and relationship. And pre-pandemic was nearly all in person. Post-pandemic is nearly all online. And what I'm trained in my field to do is to be able to create that deep human connection. A small example that came out during the pandemic by a neuroscientist, Dr. Amit Sood. He wrote an article where he suggested two very simple things, that before people go into an online or hybrid meeting with others, that they practice kind attention. And that means before they enter into that meeting or that conversation, they think to themselves and assume that the persons they're about to meet are dealing with something in their lives. And that's true for all of us. And by doing that, that automatically for us enables us to suspend judgment and to have more empathy. It's something very simple. I've offered it to many clients and they have found it's made a significant difference. A second small thing is, especially when going into something that one may have worries about or a bit anxious, feeling it could be a bit conflictual or controversial, is before entering into that conversation, think to yourself, why am I grateful to this person? And that simple practice of gratitude, again, already changes us neurologically and psychologically as we enter into an interaction. So this is effective both online and in person. And the last thing to offer is when you're doing hybrid work, there's so much to borrow from. One of them is called thinking rounds, which was developed by Nancy Glynn, a great practitioner in leadership and in very strong relations between people. And his thinking round really is a way that people can carry on a conversation without interruption. And by doing that, that means the people who typically don't offer their points of view because they perhaps feel dominated by others in the room, do offer their points of view. And while doing the thinking rounds, which has a very particular practice to it, you practice total listening. So communicators will know we typically listen, or very often listen to others, listening very selectively. We're looking for the things that they're saying that we can either agree with or counter, or that either support or negate our own arguments or points of view. Another level is actually listening to the words that they're saying. That's already better. Another level is listening into their words and into their body language and feeling a sense of what they might be experiencing. And the last and most effective level, which one would practice or try to practice in thinking rounds, is listening to others with all of those things that I've described: words, empathy, body language, and adding to that, I suspend my own thoughts and judgment. I simply take in what that other person is saying. And conversations completely transform.
That leads me just to kind of have another sort of tangential thought in the way that I do. If we come back to kind of the world of trying to understand what the stakeholders are thinking. So you can have these sort of conversations, but if you want to be doing something that's broader research and actually going out in a sort of a more mass environment, how on earth do you then kind of make sure that you're asking the right questions and that you're maybe even trying to get a sense of where is the person I'm going to be asking this question to, where are they, on this particular subject already? I mean, it makes doing research and stakeholder engagement a real minefield, which just reinforces the need to be working with experts such as ECHO. But I wonder if there are any things there, which is when you're kind of moving into more of a mass communication as opposed to the one-on-one or the small group. Is there something there that's communicators we should be thinking of doing differently? Because surely one size doesn't fit all anymore.
That's a really good question. A couple of things that come to my mind. One is, I think as communicators are working with their own leaders as maybe one of the important channels, let's say, or one of the important representatives of the mass communication. There, I think there's working with them for authentic communication, having them also work with themselves as communicators, but also people who can coach them. And I mean, coach them in a way of how can you respond in a way that is sincere? How can you respond in a way that is also commercially astute? Those two things can live together. So I think there's a role there. The other thing that comes to my mind is I do hold communicators today in great esteem, because when I imagine what they're dealing with in terms of the social media, the multiple channels, the constant onslaught, I think two things I would offer. One is really taking care of yourself and making sure that you have people around you that are helping you to remain grounded and steady, and keeping, your eye on purpose and your eye on what's important. So I think that would be one thing. And then the second thing would be the recognition that attention spans, I was just reading something that says that our attention spans have decreased by nearly a quarter in 15 years. The figures are a bit frightening, because it is decreasing from 12 seconds as an average attention span in 2000 to 8.25 seconds in 2015. I can only imagine what it is by now in 2022. So I think for the communicators, just keeping that in mind, they know that. At the same time, I would say that whenever we interact, let's say that even our interaction we're having today, or when we're listening to a podcast, or we're listening to a video, my attention is drawn in again by people who are speaking to me authentically, who bring forth knowledge. So there are many things that can hold attention, and that would be, once again, I think something the communicators could be helping their leaders and their organizations with.
Yeah, which brings us back to the whole kind of natural language element and the authenticity that we talked about right at the top of this this discussion. That and it's this kind of it needs to be genuinely genuine. It's not sort of like fake authenticity, because that's what somebody needs, because people will see through that if they know that this individual is actually sort of acting through a supposedly more authentic communications approach in a particular context, but then they step back into their normal persona and continue behaving in the way that they've always done. They're going to have another disconnect there. So I think this whole idea of candid truth, there is nowhere to hide anymore, just means that there needs to be sort of this doubling down on, is this communication going to work in the way that we are intending? Because we just have so many examples of actually where it doesn't. But I think we've covered a lot of ground through this whole conversation. But what really strikes me, thinking back to when I was in an in-house role, or even the work that I'm doing with startups now, is that this, talking about the world of communications is just a very, very different world. You've talked a lot about, there are other kind of areas to bring into the skill set. It's actually thinking very differently from communicating out. It's actually about the listening. It's about the stakeholder engagement, making that credible, making that relevant, making that timely. It's almost as if you sort of need to look at a communications function and say, how we organize today within an organization, is this really fit for purpose in terms of what we need to be achieving, or actually is there a different model? And possibly many organizations that are enlightened are already doing that. But I think for me, the world of communications that I knew is radically different, and therefore calls for different skills, different actions, different approaches. Fascinating.
Yes, I agree. And then the reflection that I have is, so much of this is about human development and adult development. And so the communicator can really be a beacon for that, I think, within his or her organization. As they do it themselves, they will by nature be in a way, positively contagious for others.
Oh, that's great, this idea of positive contagion. I always used to think of myself as like the nagging voice of conscious or consciousness, which always seemed to be so negative. But this is absolutely classic you, Nancy, that you can bring the conversation to an end today. on such a positive note, and that communicators need to think of themselves as being positively contagious in terms of the work that they're doing across business and, I would say, and society. Thank you so much indeed for this rich conversation.
Thank you, Rosie. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosie and Nancy, for such a fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. Hello, I'm Andrew White, and like Rosie, I'm a member of the ECHO Advisory Board. I've been a communications professional for 30-odd years now, in a variety of roles across the public, private and not-for-profit sectors, and in a number of different areas, like media, arts and the creative industries, government, and financial services. I've also been lucky enough to be a director of comms a few times at Arts Council England, 2 government departments, and most recently at the Financial Conduct Authority. So, to borrow Nancy's striking phrase, I've been trying to be a positive contagion for quite a while and in quite a few places. I'll be hosting the next in the ECHO Straight Talking podcast series, when we'll be picking up on 1 or 2 of the themes that Rosie and Nancy talked about. In particular, we'll be looking at expectations of leaders and how they have changed over the years and how they may or may not differ between the public, commercial and not-for-profit sectors. What do an organisation's various stakeholders, customers, shareholders, the wider public, opinion formers, activist groups, governments and regulators, and of course, an organisation's own people, what do they want from its leaders today? And what does that mean for those leaders, CEOs, chairs, boards and excos? And in turn, of course, what challenge does this present for communications professionals, who are so often the key advisors on just these sorts of questions? So, lots to get our teeth into, and I hope you'll join us.